Before we dive into this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our amazing emotional stories. Your support means everything to us. Now, let's begin this unforgettable tale. The afternoon sun blazed down on the historic grounds of Buckingham Palace, where thousands of tourists gathered to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Patricia Morrison, a 53-year-old woman from a wealthy suburb of London who considered herself above the common rules that governed ordinary people. She wore expensive designer clothes, carried a luxury handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and had the kind of attitude that made service workers cringe when she approached. Patricia had spent the entire morning complaining about everything. The traffic getting into central London was intolerable. The parking fees were robbery. The crowds were too dense and filled with tourists who didn't know proper etiquette. Her husband Richard had learned years ago to simply nod and agree, finding it easier than arguing with her increasingly entitled behavior. Their adult daughter Michelle trailed behind them, embarrassed by her mother's constant criticism, but too worn down to intervene anymore. Standing at his post near the palace gates was Guardsman Thomas Wright, a 31-year-old soldier who had served in the British Army for over a decade. His uniform was impeccable, his posture rigid and perfect, his face completely expressionless, as protocol demanded. Thomas had performed ceremonial duties dozens of times, mastering the art of remaining completely still and unresponsive, regardless of what happened around him. He had endured tourists trying to make him laugh, children waving toys in his face, and countless camera flashes. Nothing was supposed to break his concentration. The plaza was particularly crowded that day. The summer heat had everyone feeling irritable. Patricia had purchased an overpriced ice cream from a nearby vendor, complaining loudly about the cost while simultaneously eating it. When some of the melting ice cream dripped onto her expensive blouse, her face flushed with anger. She needed someone to blame, someone to take out her frustration on, and her eyes landed on the silent guard standing just a few feet away. Completely unaware that he was about to become the target of her brewing rage, Patricia finished her ice cream and looked around for a trash bin. But the nearest one was several yards away through the thick crowd. In her mind, walking that distance was beneath someone of her status. She noticed the guard standing perfectly still, and a cruel idea formed in her mind. Why should she have to walk all that way when there was someone right here who couldn't move or respond? What happened next shocked everyone within viewing distance. Patricia walked directly up to Guardsman Wright and deliberately tossed her sticky ice cream wrapper, napkins, and empty cup at his feet. The trash scattered across the pristine cobblestones, some pieces landing on his perfectly polished boots. She stood there with her arms crossed, a smug expression on her face. Waiting for some kind of reaction that would never come, Thomas remained absolutely still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as his training demanded. He had been taught to ignore all distractions, to maintain his position no matter what provocations tourists might attempt. But inside, he was carefully noting everything that was happening, aware that this situation was different from the usual tourist antics. This was deliberate disrespect, an act of entitled contempt that crossed a line. Patricia wasn't satisfied with simply littering. She wanted attention, wanted to feel powerful, wanted everyone to see that the rules didn't apply to her. She turned to the crowd around her and announced in a loud, haughty voice that the guard was there to serve the public. If he wasn't going to be useful, he might as well be a trash receptacle. Several tourists gasped at her audacity. Others pulled out their phones. Sensing that something significant was unfolding, Richard quietly urged his wife to stop, his face red with embarrassment. Michelle turned away, pretending not to know her mother. But Patricia was riding high on her sense of superiority. Emboldened by years of getting away with treating people poorly because of her wealth and social status, she reached into her handbag and pulled out more trash, old receipts and tissues, and tossed them at the guard's feet as well, laughing as if this was the most entertaining thing she had done all day. The crowd's mood shifted dramatically. What had been confusion and shock transformed into anger and disapproval. Tourists from around the world understood that these guards deserved respect, that they were real soldiers performing an important duty. The changing of the guard wasn't entertainment where people could behave however they wanted. It was a military ceremony with deep tradition and meaning. Patricia had violated an unspoken rule that even foreign visitors instinctively understood, and people began voicing their displeasure with her behavior. A Metropolitan Police officer, who had been monitoring the crowd from a distance, started walking purposefully toward the scene. Palace security personnel were already radioing for additional support. Patricia noticed the movement around her, but interpreted it incorrectly, thinking people were simply gathering to watch the spectacle she was creating. She had no idea that her moment of cruel entertainment was about to become the worst afternoon of her life. The police officer arrived at Patricia's side with a stern expression that finally penetrated her bubble of entitlement. He identified himself and informed her that she was littering on royal property, showing disrespect to a soldier on duty, and causing a public disturbance. Patricia's smug smile faltered for the first time. She tried to laugh it off, saying she was just having a bit of fun, but the officer's expression remained hard and unamused. Other security personnel formed a perimeter around the situation, and Patricia suddenly realized this wasn't going to end with a simple warning. The officer explained that littering on palace grounds carried significant fines, and her deliberate disrespect toward a member of Her Majesty's Guard was being taken very seriously. Patricia attempted to use her usual tactics, mentioning her husband's position at his law firm, dropping names of people she claimed to know in government. But none of it mattered here. Guardsman Wright remained at his post throughout this entire exchange, still perfectly motionless, still staring straight ahead. But there was something in his absolute stillness that now seemed more powerful than any words he could have spoken. He hadn't broken composure, hadn't given Patricia the satisfaction of a reaction, and in doing so, had demonstrated a dignity and professionalism that made her behavior look even more pathetic by comparison. The officer informed Patricia that she had two choices. She could accept a citation that would require her to appear in court and face potential fines of up to £500, or she could immediately clean up every piece of trash she had thrown, apologize formally to the guard and the gathered crowd, and accept a formal warning that would be kept on file. If she ever behaved this way again on any royal property, she would be banned permanently and face criminal charges. Patricia's face went through a range of emotions: shock, anger, indignation, and finally the dawning realization that she had no power here. All her money, all her social connections, all her years of bullying service workers and getting away with entitled behavior meant nothing in this moment. The crowd watched in silent anticipation, cameras recording every second. Her husband and daughter stood apart from her, making it clear they wanted no association with her actions. She tried one more time to talk her way out of consequences, suggesting that cleaning up trash was beneath her, that surely the palace had staff for such things. The officer's response was simple and devastating. He told her that creating the mess was apparently not beneath her, so cleaning it up shouldn't be either. She had exactly 1 minute to make her decision before he would proceed with the citation and court appearance. Patricia looked around desperately, hoping someone would defend her or offer support. But she found only disapproving faces and recording phones. The reality of her situation finally crashed over her like a wave. She was going to have to bend down in her expensive clothes, in front of hundreds of people and countless cameras, and pick up her own trash like a scolded child. Every instinct screamed against such humiliation. But the alternative of a court appearance and public record of her behavior was somehow even worse. With shaking hands, Patricia bent down and began picking up the scattered trash. Each piece felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The ice cream wrapper stuck to the cobblestones, forcing her to scrape at it with her manicured nails. The napkins had blown slightly in the breeze, making her walk several feet in different directions to retrieve them. The crowd watched in complete silence, the weight of their judgment almost visible in the air. As she worked, Patricia caught sight of her reflection in a nearby window. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her expensive outfit now seemed ridiculous, and her face showed the strain of having to perform manual labor she had spent her entire adult life avoiding. She glanced up at Guardsman Wright, who remained exactly as he had been, unmoved and unaffected by everything happening around him. His dignity stood in stark contrast to her disgrace. It took her nearly 10 minutes to collect every piece of trash, with the officer watching carefully to ensure she didn't miss anything. Several times she tried to leave a small piece behind, but he would point it out, making her retrieve it. When she finally had all the trash in her hands, sticky and degrading, the officer directed her to the proper waste bin 50 yards away. Patricia wanted to argue, but one look at his expression told her that any resistance would result in immediate citation. The walk to that trash bin became the longest walk of Patricia's life. The crowd parted silently to let her through, their eyes following her every step. Children asked their parents what the lady had done wrong. Teenagers snickered and whispered. Fellow tourists shook their heads in disapproval. Patricia deposited the trash in the bin with trembling hands, feeling more humiliated than she had ever felt in her entire privileged life. But the ordeal wasn't over. The officer informed her that she still needed to complete the second part of her consequence, the formal apology. Patricia's stomach dropped. Apologizing to the guard in front of all these people felt impossible, but she had come this far and had no choice but to finish. The officer escorted her back to where Guardsman Wright still stood at his post, perfect and unshaken. Standing before Guardsman Wright, Patricia struggled to find words. The officer prompted her firmly, reminding her that the apology needed to be sincere and audible to those gathered nearby. Patricia cleared her throat, her voice coming out smaller and weaker than she had ever heard it. She apologized for disrespecting him, for littering at his post, and for behaving inappropriately on palace grounds. Each word felt like it was being dragged from her throat by force. Thomas maintained his ceremonial stance throughout her apology, giving no indication that he had heard her or cared about her words. His training prevented any acknowledgement, but internally he felt a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served without him having to break protocol. The woman who had tried to humiliate him had instead humiliated herself. He hadn't needed to do anything except his duty. The officer then required Patricia to turn and address the crowd. This was perhaps the worst part of all. She had to apologize to the tourists and visitors for disrupting their experience, and setting a poor example of British behavior. Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke, tears of shame running down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. Some in the crowd accepted her apology with nods. Others simply stared, their expressions making clear that words couldn't undo what they had witnessed. The officer issued her a formal warning, explaining that her behavior had been documented and that any future incidents on royal property or involving military personnel would result in immediate arrest and prosecution. He also informed her that the palace retained the right to ban her from all royal properties if they deemed it necessary. Patricia nodded numbly, too defeated to argue or negotiate. She signed the warning form with shaking hands, officially accepting responsibility for her actions. Richard and Michelle approached once the officer stepped away. Richard's expression was a mixture of disappointment and embarrassment. He told Patricia quietly that her behavior had become increasingly unacceptable and that something needed to change. Michelle couldn't even look at her mother, instead focusing on her phone where social media was already exploding with videos of the incident. The hashtag #KarenVsGuard was beginning to trend, with millions of people watching Patricia's public humiliation. As the Morrison family walked away from Buckingham Palace, Patricia felt the weight of hundreds of eyes still on her back. The ceremony continued without further incident, Guardsman Wright maintaining his post with the same unwavering professionalism he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. For the tourists who had witnessed everything, the ceremony had become far more memorable than they had expected, though not in the way anyone could have predicted. The aftermath of Patricia's behavior extended far beyond that humiliating afternoon. By evening, multiple videos of the incident had gone viral across every social media platform. News outlets picked up the story, running segments about entitled behavior and the importance of respecting military personnel. Patricia's face became instantly recognizable, though not in any way she had ever wanted. Strangers on the internet dissected her actions, her attitude, and her obvious belief that wealth placed her above basic decency and rules. The professional consequences arrived quickly. Richard's law firm received hundreds of calls and emails from people who had seen the videos and were expressing their disgust that a partner's wife could behave so disrespectfully. The firm's senior partners called an emergency meeting, concerned about the negative publicity affecting their reputation. While they couldn't force Richard to divorce his wife, they made it clear that any future incidents involving his family would impact his position at the firm. Michelle's friends contacted her with a mixture of concern and morbid curiosity. Several admitted they had always found her mother difficult during visits, but hadn't realized how bad her entitled behavior had become. Michelle confided that she had been avoiding bringing friends home for years because of her mother's treatment of service workers and anyone she deemed beneath her status. The incident had simply made public what the family had been privately dealing with for years. Patricia herself retreated from public life completely. She deleted all her social media accounts after being flooded with criticism and mockery. She stopped attending her usual social clubs and charity events, unable to face the whispered conversations and judgmental looks. For the first time in her adult life, Patricia was forced to confront the reality of who she had become and how she had treated people. The shame was overwhelming, but perhaps necessary. After weeks of isolation, Richard insisted that Patricia seek counseling. Her therapist helped her understand that her entitled behavior stemmed from deep insecurity and a need to feel superior to others as a way of validating her own worth. Growing up with modest means, Patricia had overcompensated when she married into wealth, using money and status as weapons to distance herself from the person she used to be. The trash-throwing incident was the culmination of years of increasingly toxic behavior that had finally met consequences she couldn't avoid. The journey toward change was slow and painful. Patricia began by apologizing personally to service workers she had mistreated over the years. She volunteered at a community center, working alongside people from all walks of life and learning to see them as equals rather than beneath her. She returned to Buckingham Palace 6 months later, not as a tourist, but to deliver a handwritten letter to Guardsman Thomas Wright, thanking him for his professionalism and apologizing again for her disgraceful behavior. The letter was received by palace officials and placed in Thomas's file, a small gesture that could never undo the harm, but represented genuine effort to make amends. The incident at Buckingham Palace became a teaching moment viewed by millions. It reminded people that wealth and status don't exempt anyone from basic decency and respect. It showed that entitled behavior eventually meets consequences, no matter how long someone has gotten away with it. Most importantly, it demonstrated that true strength isn't found in the power to humiliate others, but in the dignity to remain unshaken in the face of disrespect. Just as Guardsman Wright had shown that afternoon when he refused to let a cruel woman disturb his duty or his peace.